Академик Vassil Nikolov. Това е ръководителят на...
So first of all, good day again everyone. My name is Georgi, and in the next 30 minutes I will tell you a little more about the history of this settlement. In general, we are on the territory of the first malting urban center in Europe, which arose around the beginning of 5,600 years before Christ, or around the beginning of the 56th century before Christ. The settlement arose here thanks to the salt spring, the salt deposit, which is located below us at a depth of up to 4 kilometers, and on an area of over 330 acres. This makes it one of the largest salt deposits on the territory of Eastern Europe, and the unique thing about this salt deposit is that an aquifer flows above it, which washes, that is, it once washed the upper limits of this salt body, thanks to which here on the surface there were salt springs in the past. Nowadays, this aquifer is already at a much greater depth, and there are no saline springs due to the plant's activity. We're in the Provadia area, that's the working salt plant right now, and behind you you can see one of the drills that they're drilling with to get that brine out, but in the drilling process, when they're opening these drill shafts, just this water layer sinks to depth.
Този водоносен пласт вече потъва в дълбочина.
Let's go back to prehistory. When the first people came, we don't know exactly how they discovered the salt springs. Did it make sense by accident? Whether the animals showed them that there were such salt springs, or whether they had some of their technology, we do not know, but certainly people knew in the past that salt was a very valuable commodity needed by both man and animals for physical survival of both species. People used salt to preserve food for a long period of time. With its help they processed skins, from which at a later stage they made clothes, and perhaps the most valuable and important quality of salt in prehistory is that it was the coin of exchange in prehistory, or the equivalent of money. Knowing all this, being lucky enough to find these salt springs, the people here immediately started extracting salt, and for the first 400 years or so of the existence of the settlement, this process of salt extraction was carried out on the territory of the settlement itself by means of evaporation. That is, they collect the salt water, boil it, and in this way get ready-made salt. So, from one furnace in which this process took place, from one loading of it between 20 to 25 kilograms of salt could be extracted. How exactly the furnaces were, that is, how exactly the houses were, unfortunately we still don't know, in the sense that the further back in time we want to go, the deeper we have to dig, so we have yet to uncover the story related with the first settlement since the beginning of the emergence. So in another year expect more convincing information.
Началото на възникването, така че след някоя друга година очаквайте допълнителна информация.
They certainly reached several tons of annual production annually, which is not a small amount at all, but as time went on, a purely commercial interest in salt increased, and this forced people to increase production itself. For this purpose, they move this production cycle about 150 meters north of the village itself. Unfortunately, we cannot visit the salt production center because it is located on the territory of the factory. A little later I will only be able to show where the salt production center is located. There, the technology remains the same, by boiling, but the equipment itself changes. They begin to use channel-like equipment dug into the ground. At a later stage, pit equipment dug into the ground, they begin to use. So from these canal-shaped facilities, from one of their charging between 150 to 200 kilograms of salt could be extracted. 12 such facilities we have found so far. From the pit facilities, from one loading of one such pit from 400 to 600 kilograms, they could extract salt.
А пък от ямните съоръжения, от едно зареждане на една такава яма, между 400 и 600 кг сол се могли да добиват. Със сигурност комбинираното годишно производство от ямните и каналовидни съоръжения надхвърляло няколко десетки тонни. Което означава, че хората тук са забогатели доста.
It is about the ornaments that they began to use, and these are mostly ornaments of round white shells that are found along the Mediterranean coast, which means that the people who directly or indirectly traded with the people who lived in the south. The other ornaments that began to be widely used were ornaments made of copper. At that time, copper also came from the White Sea, that is, from the south. In 100% of cases where there is copper, there is also gold, so the gold they used also came from the White Sea. Unfortunately, however, this enrichment of the people here did not go unnoticed, and the attacks on the settlement began, and this forced the local population to start building already more solid stone walls for defense. And here behind you, you can see the restored two parts of the first stone fortress wall, which arose at the beginning of 4700 BC, or about 900 years after the original settlement. You can see that they are two parts of one wall. History is a little more interesting to us, not to the people of that time. Something done for the first time still had a very clear idea of how a stone wall should be built and what it should look like, and originally the stone wall was only around the two entrances. In a little while we will pass by one of the entrances. At the end of the tour I will show you this entrance more closely. So let's say at the very beginning the stone wall flanked only the steps, and later the wall continued with a wooden palisade or a wooden wall plastered with clay. Unfortunately, however, this construction only survived for about 50 years, and as a result of an earthquake, it was destroyed. Earthquakes are very common here, a very common phenomenon, because the area because of the salt body below us is seismically active, and earthquakes happen often. And again, I say unfortunately, only about 50 years the first part of the first wall survived, and in the middle of the 47th century they built the first wall for the second time. This is the narrower wall that you see. It is already of a completely closed type. That is, the whole wall already was built of stone. But ironically, it only survived for about 50 years, and towards the end of 4700 BC, the first wall was finally completely destroyed by an earthquake, and the people here began to build and use the second wall, which is behind you. What you see of it are its restored parts, but I'll tell you a little more about that wall in a little bit. If there are no questions, we continue. So, here in front of you, you see the now authentic remains of the first stone fortress wall. On the left, the large stones you see are part of this first attempt at building the wall. In height, the smaller stones you see are already from the second attempt to build the first wall. Here are two more interesting moments that I want to show you.
тук два са по-интересните момента, които искам да ви покажа.
First, up opposite us, where the two metal columns are, you can see one of the two entrances connected to the fortress, that is, the fortress wall. The other thing that's more interesting here, in the low part you can see the remains of a ditch facility that actually ran in front of the wall, and you see the big stones fell into that ditch facility.
Големите камъни са паднали именно в това ровово съоръжение.
Now, unfortunately, we cannot say if it was full of water in the past. It was about 2 meters wide and also about 2 meters deep, which was quite enough to create great difficulties for the attackers, because at that time there was no siege equipment yet. The only thing that comes closest to the siege technique is the rope ladders, which unfortunately cannot be used to overcome such a trench facility. And so, questions. If there are no questions, let's continue. I will only ask that you be careful here on the left. Here in front of you, you see again most of the restored part of the second wall. Here where the masters are above the boards, the wall is up to 3 meters and a half high and has been preserved in its original authentic form. It is thanks to her that the wall was restored in the way you see it now. There are two more curious moments related to the second wall. The first is that they tried not to make the same mistakes as with the first. And they make the wall much wider compared to the first one, as in width it varies from 2 meters and a half to 4 meters and a half in places, and in height it reached at least 6 meters in height. Which makes it quite a massive stone structure. Purely for comparison specifically, the second wall is 2,000 years older than the pyramids of Giza. Here, the wall, I say again, arose at the beginning of 4600 BC, and the pyramids in Giza are at the beginning of 2600 BC. The other more interesting and curious point related to the wall is that it narrows the diameter of the settlement itself. You can see here in the low part in front of us where the remains of the first wall pass, and in the background the second wall passes. Most likely, this narrowing was done in order to facilitate the protection itself, because the smaller the area, the easier the protection itself can be provided. The important clarification we need to make when we talk about an attack, do not imagine attacks like in the Middle Ages when a multi-thousand army besieged the fortress walls. Here, no more than 150 people carried out the attacks. There's no way 150 people could be attacking so evenly to succeed. By way of logic, they should cluster in one place. And when the area is smaller, the defenders themselves can reach that point much more easily, much faster, where the attackers struggle to overcome the wall. And so, unfortunately, after only about 150 years of existence, again due to an earthquake and the second wall is being destroyed, and most likely, this spilled the beans, so to speak, and people started looking for other ways to protect themselves, especially to deal with earthquakes. And they decided to raise the level of the settlement itself, but for this purpose they had to fill the old settlement first. And you see here the finger that actually lies on the second wall and here on the remains of the first wall with it. That is, with the help of this finger, they buried the remains of the first and second walls and the settlement itself, which was behind the second wall. And so already in the middle of 4,400 odd a year before Christ, or around the middle of the 44th century before Christ, the mound itself began to form in height. It reaches about 9 meters, and on this 9th meter they are making a flat site on which they are already building the new settlement and on which they are already building the third wall. But I will tell you about it in a moment. Now, while we're here, I want you to look behind you across the road is the salt production center here. Where is this flat clearing that you see? And the other part, unfortunately, is now hidden by the walnut. But this field with about a dozen acres is part of the salt production center, which is being studied these days. But again, unfortunately, the factory does not allow us, it does not allow the free movement of people in this part. The other thing I want you to look at while we are here on your right, where is the elevation? It is from this elevation that they took the stone material with which they built the walls. And to your left in the distance you can see an excavator and a wagon next to it. The river Provadia flows there. It is no accident that I show them these places. The settlement itself, they made it in the middle between as close as possible to the three most basic sources of fresh water. Salt water from which they make the salt and stone material that they use to build the walls, and the fourth resource that they used a lot was timber, but unfortunately we have no way of knowing in the past where the forests were. But there certainly wasn't as much arable land here, so we assume it was a more wooded area. But the forests do not leave any traces in the soil. So questions so far. One question, when it's cluttered, how do you decide which is more important, the remains below or the remains above? The remains above are related to the Thracian period. All of them are important in their own right, but prehistoric sites are less in Bulgaria and in general in the world. Such settlements from this period are not so common. And that is why the main focus is on the prehistoric part of the settlement. But there is no way to study the prehistoric settlement without also studying the Thracian layer, the Thracian building, which you will see remains of in a moment. But we are looking at both studies going on in parallel.
гледаме паралелно да вървят и двете.
Because if we go only from the top down to excavate, we must first excavate this Thracian building to be studied first, which will greatly delay the process of researching the prehistoric settlement itself and therefore the main activity, and now as long as the terrain allows here on the periphery, so that tell the village itself that for the past 3 years, the upper part of this Thracian building has been taken down and filled like this with great effort.
Тук вече от последните 3 години се сваля и насипа така по-усилено и в горната част, нали, на тази тракийска сграда, но нали, просто
Again, many parts of the overall history of the site are yet to be revealed. Because the site is not only a prehistoric settlement, it is not only a Thracian building. It is a combination of both. Yes. He is interested in the big holes. What are they made of? The small ones are from bee-eaters for the big ones, and the big ones are from badgers.
Да, големите са от язовци.
The badger story here is a bit more interesting. In a little while, when we turn a little more with the circumference, I will show you where the pipe is, a pipe that takes the finger off the embankment of the Thracian building. So 2007, excavations began here in 2005.
2007 година, нали, разкопките започват 2005 година тук, била една равна могила.
It was a flat mound like all ordinary roadside mounds, and in 2007 some badger made a tunnel, and when he poked his finger out, he also pulled out a lot of Thracian ceramics, and then it really became clear.
В смисъл, когато изкарва пръста, изкарва и много тракийска керамика. И тогава реално се разбира за...
I will show you the level at which this tunnel was made by the badger, but until then it was not known that there was a Thracian layer in the upper part, and actually thanks to the badger, it was understood at the very beginning.
Допринесла за археологията.
В Англия язовец римски монети.
Да, да, там такива са пластовете, нали?
Не, иска да ви кажа, че,
че там...
язовец е бил сечен на римски.
Според зависи, да, те римските монети, нали, там според зависи така, императорите, всеки император се е избирал какво да сече на... И така.
Here now, the stones facing us in the lower part are the remains of the third wall. These are the original parts, the authentic third-party parts that have survived to this day, but unfortunately have not been preserved in very good condition due to human activity. And this human activity was caused precisely by the settlement of the Thracians on the territory of this settlement. The Thracians came here towards the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 1st century BC. When they came here, they found a depopulated settlement because prehistoric life ceased in the middle of the 43rd century BC, or about 4350 BC, due to climatic changes.
350 година преди Христа вследствие на климатични промени.
Yes, these are animal bones that are so common in the finger.
Често срещани в пръста.
Coming here, the Thracians discovered a deserted settlement that had not been inhabited for over 4,000 years.
Над 4000 години не е било обитавано.
They simply find a ready-made stone material that they take advantage of. It was the stone material from the third wall that was reused to build a large part of the Thracian building. And here, where the cut stones and the stones under the nylons on the left are part of the wall of this Thracian building. It is most likely a villa or a residence of some of the local rulers or governors, who are also very likely involved in salt production. But at this stage, we cannot say for sure that they were engaged in solo production. But certainly the person who ordered and for whom the building was built was wealthy, and after his death his subordinates buried him in the upper part of the mound, that is, above the building itself. The Thracians themselves build a burial mound, and in the last 7 meters is this burial mound, which together with the Thracian building has yet to be explored.
Заедно с тракийската сграда, те първа предстои да бъдат проучени.
But again, I say over time, and it will.
И това ще стане.
And so questions.
Въпроси?
We don't dig it. According to the factory, in the late 60s, it would have been a bomb shelter. We cannot say whether this is the case or whether it is a mining tunnel, in the sense that we simply do not know whether the factory is telling the truth. Or if they're telling the truth, well, a bomb shelter. If a treasure tunnel, most likely the treasure hunters assumed that it was a burial mound in general, and by digging towards the center of the mound, they hoped to find the burial chamber, and specifically the burial gifts, which in most cases are more expensive items, that is, than made of precious metals. But if they were treasure hunters, they were simply unlucky, so to speak, because the first 9 meters of the mound is a settlement mound, that is, digging in the soil. The only thing they will find are the layers of ceramics and plasters, that is, the remains of houses. Nothing of any interest to them. And is it known who were the first inhabitants? A Thracian population is believed to be, in general, without the written history of mankind. I don't know their names, not sure what language they spoke. It is assumed that they spoke Semitic languages. In such a sense, this is assumed because towards the end of the 8th millennium before Christ, there is a displacement of the people who inhabit today's Asia Minor as a result of climate changes, and a part of them leave for north, another part go south. Those who go north gradually reach the Balkans and our lands, and those who go south, I apologize.
Тези, които тръгват на юг, извинявам се.
Yes.
So that's Thracian, right? And they came afterwards.
Yes, good.
Добре, добре. Хайде.
Those who go south reach the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These are the future Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and therefore genetically the population is the same, and therefore it is assumed that they spoke similar languages. But unfortunately, there are some evidences left from Mesopotamia, and in general this culture survived a little longer period of time, and already the Egyptians and Hellenes are contemporaries of these civilizations.
Нали, и египтяните, и елините са, така да кажем, съвременници.
They actually give information about what language they spoke, what language they wrote, while here this population left the lands of southern Europe long before the arrival of the Hellenes before the Egyptians, these two civilizations whose writing was actually read. It leads to a Thracian population, known to come from Asia Minor, but so far that's all.
Реално има разчетие на писмеността. Води се до тракийско население. Знае се, че идват от Мала Азия, но за сега е само толкова.
They are supposed to come from there actually.
Знае се, че идват оттам.
Along the path of ceramics, it has its evolutionary development, and along the path from Asia Minor to here, this development of ceramics is traced, together with the development of ceramics and the development of man.
Се проследява това развитие на керамиката и заедно с развитието на керамиката и развитието на човека.
So if there are no other questions, let's continue. Here you see before you the restored parts of the third wall, excluding the embankment they are making to raise the level of the settlement. The wall itself is made of 3 separate stone elements, the first of which is the stone casing representing these ancient stones, arranged along the slope itself. In reality, the stone coat covered the entire slope, so to speak. The role of the stone casing was to protect the slope from erosion. That is, the winds and rains could not destroy, that is, pull the finger down, and served as the basis of the second element. These are these radial walls that you see, these parallel walls that you see. Their role was to divide the attackers into smaller and more convenient groups to repel. You see in the corridors that are formed between them no more than 2. 3 people side by side can climb at the same time. Once inside such a corridor, the attackers become a very easy target for the defenders because they have no room to maneuver. And the third element is again a vertical fortress wall, a small part of which you can see here, restored, right there where the radial walls themselves end. Meaning, do not confuse it with the wall, which is part of the Thracian building. This is the cut stone wall you see at the top. Unfortunately, I say again, as a result of human activity, the third wall was badly damaged, and only here were we able to find preserved remains of the vertical part of the wall, and therefore only here was it restored. This is how the settlement looked from the outside when the third wall was completed, and the level of the settlement itself is perhaps where the workers are. This is the level of the settlement itself in prehistory. And the most interesting thing is that here between these 5 radial walls, over 500 bones and stone arrowheads and spears that we have found that show us that quite a few battles were fought on these walls. And here in the high part, the wall that you see with the cut stones is part of this Thracian building, and at the very bottom to the right of the wall you can see two stone columns that are part of the entrance to this Thracian building, but we are yet to reveal.
Които пък са част от входа на тази тракийска сграда, но пак тепърва предстои да разкриваме.
Yes, we have yet to uncover the history of the Thracian habitation layer.
Новите, смисъл, не новите, а историята свързана с тракийския план.
And here is where the worker is next to the pipe with the yellow funnel up or down at the level of maybe on his head was this pit from the badger.
На нивото на, може би на главата му, беше тази яма от язовец. Да, и
I say again, thanks to him, it was understood at the beginning that there was a Thracian layer. Not that without him it would not have been discovered, but it would have been later.
Една последна.
It's fascinating because you're looking through.
Yes, it is. I still I didn't expect. I have no idea what would be like.
Here, this facility below us is a salt mining facility that dates back to late 4400 BC or around the end of the 44th century BC. As a result of climatic changes, which I told you were the reason for the departure of the settlement, it is a matter of drying the climate, which affects the flow rate of the saline springs. Here too, people looked for an alternative way to extract salt and intentionally or accidentally built the prototype of modern Anhialos. That is, in this facility they already use the sun as the main source of energy for evaporation of brine. That is, they do not use fire here, they use the sun. Here they poured the salt water and waited for the sun to do all the work, and this was possible thanks to the fact that they managed to plaster the floor of this facility with clay. Here you can see very clearly the dark layer that you see, this dark soil that you see, this is the sterile level, the level in which there are no traces of human activity, and above it you see a yellow lighter soil. This is clay. It is with which they artificially plaster the floor and in this way ensure that they do not have large losses of brine that is poured into the facility. You see here in places where we have disturbed this layer of clay, the soil water is starting to break out. That is, the clay protects not only from penetration from the top down and from knocking out water from the bottom up. What you're seeing right now is fresh water churning. It is yet to be understood how large the facility was because it has been going on here below us and across from us there at the other end, literally from the beginning, but it is yet to be revealed. After a little closer you will also see the chutes, that is, these chutes are currently covered under the white cloth. They are also part of this facility. When we get to the bridge I will tell you. So come here a bit so you can see.
Гледайте малко насам, за да може да виждате.
Here these chutes and channels that you see are also part of the facility, and they are similarly coated with clay.
И те по идентичен начин са обмазани с
We assume that their role was to serve as overflows. That is, with their help, they regulated the level of water that was poured into the evaporator itself.
Регулирали нивото на водата, което бива изсипано в така да кажем самия изпарител.
And I say again, as a result of drought here, the springs themselves are beginning to decrease, and most likely the facility itself was built this way because of the discovery by the people of a new spring.
Самото съоръжение е изградено така, заради откриването от страна вече на хората на един
Right here, right where the right leg of the bridge is, you can see how this slightly oval outline that the pit
може
has.
да видите тези леко овални очертания, които има ямата.
This is a well that was artificially dug by people.
Изкуствено изкопан от хората.
At about 10 meters in depth they reached and began to break out salt water, but we sealed it so as not to flood ourselves unnecessarily.
Солена вода, но ние го запечатахме, за да не се наводняваме пък излишно.
Most likely, they took salt water from here to fill the facility, and in this way, for the last less than 100 years, they ensured the extraction of salt.
Последните така около по-малко даже от стотина години са си осигурявали солодобива и солопроизводство.
And the last thing left to show you is here across from the bridge. That is, on both sides of the bridge you can see the restored parts of the first wall. And actually the railing of the bridge goes through this second entrance that we found in the first wall.
И реално парапета на моста заминава през този втори вход, който сме открили, свързан с първата стена. В височина това, което пък е с втория вход, с втората стена, това не е вход, това е от нас оставена в такава просека, за да може да се качваме в височина.
And so, that's it for now. Life and health, in the coming years we will work on the safety at the top of the object, but for now it is dangerous both for you and for the object itself to go up there.
Но за сега и за вас, и за самия обект е опасно качването горе. Най-вече за вас, то толкова на обекта на пръста няма какво да изстане, но
Is not safe. If you have questions,
How they engineered these things is amazing. And when you look right now, you're looking through time, aren't you?
in the upper part, actually, it's just an embankment. There's no remains.
да. Значи,
Now, this level at which the workers are, this is the level of the Thracian layer. When the Thracians come and they accumulate a certain amount of earth to be able to level.
Да стоят наравно. Над тях, тук то вече и не се вижда миналата година.
Can you see the holes from the bee-eaters? There is an arc described, a darker layer, and above it there are almost no holes from the bee-eaters until the building itself is buried.
И над нея почти няма дупки от пчелояди. До там е затрупан.
The burial part of the mound is built above this darker layer. Whether there is a burial chamber or whether they only built a burial mound, we cannot say.
Погребална част на могилата. Сега дали има погребална камера или само надгробна могила са изградили, това още не може да кажем, но нали,
almost to the top, as a result of human activity, the mound has been piled up. Above, where the wooden railing is the embankment for a mound.
Където е дървеният парапет за могила.
Да, надгробната могила. И вече последните около 20 сантиметра, там където е знамето, реално има така излята една бетонна площадка, има направен репер от завода. Това е така геодезистите на завода правят такива замервания всяка година. Дали в следствие пък на дейността на завода няма слягане на пластовете. В горната част имат такъв репер, но в един момент той ще бъде отстранен. съветвам, ако имате време и желание.
If you have time and desire, of course, visit the Historical Museum in Provadia. In the prehistory room, all the items are from here.
В зала Праистория са от тук.
The other place where you can see objects from here is in Sofia, in the Archaeological Museum, but there you have to specifically look at which object is from where, because there are items from all over Bulgaria.
Там има от цяла България.
In the Historical Museum, you will build on the information from here because you will actually see the vessels that used the already restored ones, and of course, vessels, photos from the salt production center, photos from the necropolis, that is, photos of the graves themselves.
Снимки от солопроизводствения център, снимки от некропола, т.е. снимки на самите гробове.
The necropolis that was found here associated with the settlement is about 50, 60 meters behind you where the walnut tree is now. But unfortunately, when a necropolis is explored, nothing remains of it because when a grave is obtained, no bones remain in it, nor do the funeral offerings remain in it.
Когато бъде проучен един гроб, нито кости остават в него, нито погребалните дарове остават в него.
My advice is, I say again, if you have the time and desire, and if not, you can also find a lot of information on the Facebook page.
Facebook страницата също може така информация да намерите, доста така.
Interesting information analyzes related to discoveries made here at the site.
На обекта.